Welcome to another episode of Healing Her Halo. I'm your host, Patience Murray, and today I'm joined by somebody truly special, Cristina Pearse. A native of Hawaii, battled PTSD for decades until participating in the MAPS clinical trial, a MDMA-assisted therapy for moderate to severe PTSD. It was a randomized, placebo-controlled phase 3 trial, and her profound recovery inspired her to establish the Protea Foundation, a public charity dedicated to women's trauma recovery. She is also pursuing a clinical mental health counseling MA at Wake Forest University. Her mission is to help trauma victims connect the dots between undiagnosed traumatic injury and current mental health, turning hashtag #MeToo into hashtag #MeHealed. Christina's past life was rich and varied. She was a serial entrepreneur, restaurateur, internet marketing executive, sommelier, and triathlete. She entered the University of Colorado at Boulder at age 16, earning a BA in Organizational Development and an MBA from Regis University. Cristina hopes to inspire others to seek a fully actualized life free from the shackles of traumatic injury. Cristina, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Patience. It's an honor to be here, truly.
Well, I just start for starters. Let's just get into the name of your foundation, Protea. It sounds so pretty. What does that actually mean?
So the Protea is an extraordinary flower. Symbolically, it actually needs a fire in order to flourish. So it has to go through trauma in order for it to spread its seed and repopulate. And it is one of the most amazingly resilient floral strains on this planet. So it seemed really fitting that this should be our symbol, and especially because it grew on the fields of the slopes of the Hawaiian Islands.
That is beautiful. So, what inspires you to have this messaging around the resilience and the trauma recovery? What's your story?
So I think, as you alluded to in my introduction, I'm in my 50s now, and for most of my life, I suffered PTSD. But I didn't know this until my mid 40s, if you can believe that. So I suffered from chronic trauma as a child. And then as an adult, those symptoms really started to emerge despite having some success in life. So what looked maybe more tidy on the outside was absolutely not indicative of what was going on for me internally.
Wow.
And as I hit my mid 40s and actually spoke with a therapist team with my medical practice who said, when we connect the dots between some of your childhood traumatic experiences and, to present time, PTSD might be something that's far more, applicable in this situation instead of all the things I had been diagnosed previously. Things like anxiety, depression. I even had a diagnosis of bipolar, and you want to talk about stigma, right? As soon as you get these kinds of, diagnoses,
The
they really
labeling.
can impact you. Absolutely. And the takeaway from all of it was that somehow I was flawed. Somehow there was something that was wrong with me. It wasn't until having this diagnosis then as PTSD that I started to do some research and figure out what is that? What does it mean? What do I do from here? But to my dismay, the exact same medications that I had been prescribed previously, even for depression and anxiety, were the same things that were being offered to me for PTSD. So even knowing that this was not something that was biologically wrong with me, I was still being prescribed the same medications as if there was something that had happened. And I just felt like there had to be something better. And that's what led me to look toward the internet to find out, what other emergent treatments are there for trauma, what's out there. I came across the MAPS trial, clinical trial, as part of a Google search because I was looking up things like ketamine and all other emergent therapies in this area, and I was a little uncomfortable with the ketamine because my understanding was you didn't necessarily have full agency under that kind of therapy.
And
Um,
and what was that therapy,
so
Cristina?
Ketamine is effectively a medication that's used for to help people through traumatic experiences. It basically helps to minimize the impact of the traumatic experience in real time.
Okay.
As I've learned, it can be really effective in some cases. In my case, because I came from a sexual trauma, childhood, sexual trauma, it was very scary to me to be in a room with a therapist where I might not have full presence. When I read about the MDMA trial, one of the things that really drew me to it is that MDMA, even though it is considered a psychedelic, it's actually more of an empathogen. So, in other words, you don't lose agency. You are actually really present and aware, even when you are sitting with the medication.
That's
So,
important.
very important, and especially with that history. So that was something that was very encouraging to me. Remarkably, I was accepted into the study. I want to point out that one of the things that the study, even though it addresses, moderate and severe PTSD, the some of the MDs and scientists in the space really thought that complex PTSD, meaning the kind of chronic PTSD that comes from having multiple experiences, multiple traumatic injuries, especially in childhood, is all but incurable. It's really difficult to provide therapy for people who have never been safe. And so, there was sort of a slight caveat of whether or not, this psychedelic therapy would work on someone like me.
Wow.
I'm now here today to tell you that not only does it work, it actually is probably one of the few, if only, options for someone with complex PTSD. And in a minute, I'll connect the dots on why that is so important, and especially for women, and especially because of the prevalence of gender based violence.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. I don't think most people, taking that initiative, right? Just doing a Google search, looking up some information for your own healing, and then taking action on it to where you're a part of it, even putting yourself out there to even apply for the clinical trial. These are steps that we may never take for ourselves in our healing, thinking that we're just going to be this way forever, you know?
I couldn't agree with you more. And as part of our mission as a foundation, it is to step back and really educate people that those things that they suffer from have a name. It isn't just the symptoms. So, like I said, for decades, I thought I suffered from depression and anxiety. It turned into, for me, where I would self medicate and start using substances. For me, it was alcohol to try to numb the anxiety, right? It made social situations easier. It made dealing with issues that I didn't want to
Mhm.
feel, triggered by, right? It allowed me to numb those things. But as we know, alcohol can really turn against us when it's
Yeah, yeah. I relate so much to that. Yeah.
absolutely. So I just that's message number one, is that so much of PTSD is actually undiagnosed for many people, because we live within a healthcare context that really looks for the symptoms first to give it a name, but we don't do as well of a job of really pausing for a moment and saying, "Hang on right here. Tell me about your history. Tell me about traumatic injury. Tell me about the kind of household that you grew up in. What factors were present? Did you have, trusted protective guardians around you? Did you have food insecurity, heat insecurity? Was there violence? Um, there is a growing awareness now around ACEs testing, which is adverse childhood events testing. And Nadine Burke Harris, who is the former Surgeon General for California, fantastic, amazing work that she has done to connect ACEs, which is this little self-scoring exam that people can take, and life expectancy. And I'm going to tell you, patients, something that's going to
Wow.
shock you, I think, when people really hear this statistic. An ACEs score of 4 or more can translate into as much as a 20-year reduction in life expectancy. So when you sit with that for a minute,
Oh
it
my
makes
God.
you really realize that there are really strong correlations behind chronic traumatic injury and those kinds of, situational things that are really all too common, to be honest, and what that actually means for people later in life. And we
So,
don't connect the dots.
and the dots there is, so scoring 4 or more on this ACEs test, it directly correlates with your life expectancy, meaning that you will most likely lose 20 years of your life if you're
Correct.
higher than 4.
Yes.
That's a staggering statistic.
Yeah. And especially when you realize that most of the people alive today have at least a score of 1. I would argue that most of us have at least 2. We get another point for having lived through COVID, which was a very existential experience, right?
Yes, yes.
So, already there, we're starting to sort of, tip people into, a higher risk category. And that's before things like death of a loved one or, alcoholism in your household or these other factors are present. So that's sort of the first step, is really understanding just how prevalent these kinds of chronic traumatic injuries are for people. And then from there, really trying to outline on top of that what happens all too often for women.
Thank you. So, just the phrase traumatic injury, is that different from like brain injury, or different from like other, like how do you basically know if you've been injured by trauma?
To me, I'm using it in the context of mental health. But
Okay.
as we know, are you familiar with Bessel van der Kolk's work, The Body Keeps the Score?
I heard of the book title, but never, I didn't hear his name, but yes.
So amazing, a doctor, Bessel van der Kolk. I had the honor of meeting him at a trauma conference this past year in May, and one of the things that he really connects, again, the dots for us, is to understand that when trauma occurs to us, it isn't just a mental construct. It does actually leave a mark in our bodies. And the way that that manifests is people who have traumatic injury typically have this fight flight response. And that is because there is neurological impact to us. It's also adrenal. There's, cortisol. There's a lot of different systems that are implicated in traumatic injury. So it isn't just something that our minds can overcome. There is truly a scenario where if your body gets stuck in this feedback cycle of responding in a narrowing way, which is through the fight, flight, fear, fawn, response, that path gets so well worn that over time people that are suffering lose the ability to discern other things, how they're feeling about something, because the fight flight response becomes so automatic. Then over time, again, very much in my experience, the originating source of trauma, so it might be sexual trauma, violent trauma, wartime trauma, whatever it is, isn't the only thing that triggers our bodies into that cycle. Other types of trauma then start to impact us. So it explains why I like to say it this way, which is, when once trauma enters the house, it's sort of like having a drafty house.
Mm,
Other kinds of trauma really start to trigger that, and our bodies really over time, we can't discern between that original trauma and other things that are triggering the trauma. So it really highlights, and you can tell me if you've had this experience as well, but where it expands, it's like, I don't know why this
yeah.
is other thing is bothering me now, but I'm still triggered as if it was something else, right?
Yeah, yeah, that happens to me so often, and I always thought that, maybe I'm either not doing the work, or maybe the work isn't sticking, right? It feels like you're on that cycle of, oh, you think you're getting better, and then something happens, and it may not, like you said, be directly related to the event that you were traumatized by to begin with, but it still strikes those same chords,
Oh,
and
I
it
want to
feel, yeah.
Absolutely. And I want to honor you right now immediately and tell you that you are doing the work. I can tell just by the work you're doing here and providing a platform for additional people to speak about their experience. This is something that goes beyond your mind and your thought. This is beyond cognition. This is physiological damage that has occurred in your body. And so to overcome that, I think we need better treatment options. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm really trying to vocalize not only what the psychedelic therapies have to offer, but also just how much better we need to be at diagnosing and providing a pathway for people forward. We need better treatment options. There's no question.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And sometimes I feel like things could get really fluffy, and sometimes even metaphysical, right? So we have different, like the mind is more powerful than the body, and all these
Mhm.
different things, and which are very true. They also exist. But like you're saying, the physical body, it needs repair as well. So it's not just, you can't treat one side of it without making sure that the actual physiological is taken care of too.
Absolutely. And I think that's so much why there is a rise or an upswell in people recognizing that somatic therapy is so important for trauma victims. Body work, right? Doing things, creatively, drawing, yoga, mindfulness practice. I mean, all these various things to just bring your mind and body back into synchronization again. I know from my perspective as a lifelong victim, I didn't want to believe all of this mind body stuff. I was very resistant to that. I always felt like it was something out there, but I'm here today to say that it's really real. Your body really is sort of unplugged, if you will. And when your mind is unplugged from your body and you're no longer trusting the kinds of feelings that you're having, or you're no longer able to discern a real threat from a non-threat, that's absolutely something that plays tricks on your mind. But that is a result of your body being disconnected from your mind.
Wow, I think that's going to free a lot of people, because I know I can't be the only one who's had that experience as well. Of feeling like it's almost like you're in this repetitive cycle of this continuing suffering, right? That you just can't get off of, or just out of the cycle. But thank you so much for sharing that and educating us on these different facets that really do play a part in how we show up and how we experience every day in our lives.
Absolutely. And again, I want to reiterate for people who are feeling like, gosh, I can get past this, I can do better. Like as you identified, you don't want to be identifying as a victim, right? That resilience that is within you is what propels you to know that you can get over it. But in many cases, that traumatic injury is really working against you. So it's really trying to understand a pathway forward that takes that into account. And again, I don't think that enough um, importance or education is out there to help us figure out that way forward yet.
So thank you for what you're doing with your foundation as well. So what are some of these alternative methods, right, of getting this trauma out of the body, or changing the pattern, or the actual way that our body is in rhythm with the trauma? Like, how do we actually do that? What worked for you?
So for me, I had the amazing gift of being in this clinical trial. Um, what I had experienced in the decades prior was everything from anti anxiety, antidepressant medications, anticonvulsants. I mean, you name it. I feel like I had a lot of medicines thrown at me. I also pursued a lot of therapeutic modalities. So I tried, cognitive behavioral therapy and all sorts of, traumatic re experience, um, you know, yoga. I mean, you name it. Um, Many things had benefit far more on the somatic side than I can ever, give attribution for the actual drugs. For me personally, in my experience, taking an antidepressant, specifically an SSRI, actually led me to a point where I committed suicide or I attempted suicide. So I am. one to tell you that if there is traumatic injury, I really urge people to be aware that that's a big warning sign that that traumatic injury is giving you feelings of sadness. It's giving you feelings of anxiety for a reason. And SSRIs and other medications may be effective at reducing those symptoms, but I'm not sure that the best thing for our bodies in that experience is to move us further away from feeling or numbing those feelings or dulling those feelings. I think again the goal is to try to be more in touch with those things, but do it in a way when you're not going to self-harm. um
Yeah, and
yeah,
thank you so much for sharing that with us.
yeah, that was a terrible experience on top of trauma already, to then have to go through that scenario where I mean, to be perfectly honest, it more or less destroyed my career at that point. I had a colleague who decided that she was going to share with the rest of the company, what I had told her, which is that I had, attempted suicide.
Oh my
I really
God.
knew that it was on this medication, and I felt like that was absolutely one of, like, I wouldn't have gone there, on my own. But that was so, that made the trauma even worse, right? And the stigma associated around that. um
Yeah, what
and
a betrayal. Yeah, what
oh,
a complete
absolutely,
betrayal. Yeah,
absolutely.
of trust, of just safety, all these things. Like and obviously maybe she is in her own healing journey or anything like that, but just the fact that something so sensitive was shared and just spread, that I'm so sorry you had to go through that.
Oh, thank you. You brought up, I think, one of the most insightful moments that I had when I went through the clinical trial, which I'll go back to here in a minute, but was recognizing that for people like me that have a lot of trauma occur, right? When you sort of look at all of those dots, it's really hard to come up with the one that's the worst, because that's individual to all of us. So, one of the things that I discovered when I went through the trial and when I actually had the opportunity to have the MDMA assisted therapy was that in my very first session, I had this remarkable sense of sort of mental repair. Um, and one of the insights that came to me very, very, very quickly during that session, which lasts several hours, but during that session was, as horrible as the sexual assaults were for me at that age, the bigger trauma was a betrayal trauma. At the time, I told a guardian what was happening to me, and she didn't believe me. And as a matter of fact, even said, "Aren't you getting enough attention already?" And when you're that young and you're that age, of course, your response is to go, wow, okay, so it's not safe to talk about it. I'm not going to be believed. It's going to be made even worse, right? And so you shut that down, you sweep that under the rug. So it wasn't until I had the MDMA therapy where I was able to reflect on the fact that the betrayal trauma was even worse than the original traumas. It was trying to go to someone and tell them. And so I think you really hit upon that when, again, later taking a medication and having a symptom come up, that then gets removed to the point of where I go, oh gosh, maybe killing myself is a good idea. That now that the pain is gone, like, I feel happy about this, right? And then making that attempt and then again being betrayed in confidentiality with a colleague. That was really tough. So, yeah.
And I appreciate you sharing just part of your story when you were sharing with an adult at the time or guardian at the time. And I can only imagine like the devastation that you must have went through at that time of not being believed and not having your truth validated by a person that you would expect to care for you and have your back and protect you. So I completely I just feel for that little girl in you. I
Thank
do.
you. It
That
was not, because I was so young, the good news is I don't really know that I had the full impact of the feelings at that age. But later, when I was able to then put away the fight flight response long enough to really process through a lot of these memories and feelings and everything, that's when I was really able to discern that and mourn that little
Yeah.
girl. Yeah.
Um, it's such important work that you had to do within yourself because let's say if you never uncovered that, and you're kind of treating other or like addressing other parts of the trauma without getting to that root of what was that heart crushing disconnect, when that actually happened, right? And I too have like complex traumas, right? So I survived the Pulse nightclub shooting when I was 20 years old.
Um,
So, but prior to that, I survived my mother not being in my life since I was 2 years old, not having any idea where she was, or to this day have no idea like where my mother is, right? Feeling that abandonment, right? The trauma of that. My father, he struggled with alcoholism, and he also was diagnosed with being bipolar, but his situation was a little bit more extreme and wasn't able to actually live with him. So the trauma of feeling like I'm grieving two parents, even though I have one, but I don't really have them, and so many traumas after that, right? And I got to a point when my brother died in 2020 where I was like, okay, like I don't know how I'm going to be able to process all of these things at the same time, right? And I did go through more of like a mental spiral over the course of the next year, right? And COVID on top of that, it was a lot of things going on. But it inspired me to create this platform, Healing Her Halo, because I'm like, there's no way that I'm the only person feeling the way that I'm feeling of like, this is just too much. Like, at this point, and now I'm surviving something again, like something else is happening, and now I have to process this on top of the 18 other things that I have to process. There is Giving up is not an option, quitting is not an option. So what do I have to do realistically to get healing, right? So I feel like how you're saying you took that effort and you made the effort later in life, and it wasn't right away. It took you several years to come to this place of, what, let's see what else is out there. What are my options? What can I do to help myself or help that little girl inside of me and not give up? And I'm so proud of you. And I'm so proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so inspired by listening to what you've come through. I just again want to reiterate your resilience is remarkable to come through all of those experiences. And as you know, like you are so resilient to have come through what you have come through. And it makes perfect sense that when your body gets stressed by other new stressors, when, other things happen, that you can sort of be re-traumatized, and that opens that door wide open again. But again, here you are, coming right back to it. So I honor you in that. In so many ways, I feel like I got a bit of the easy button in that I got to go through this trial, because I cannot tell you how profound it was to sit with the MDMA in these sessions. And again, this is because I myself you have to have that self-awareness to understand what it is you need to heal in order to get past these things, right? I liken it to being in a river. All of our rivers look different. We're traveling down. All of our, obstacles are very different. We're all different everything looks very different to each of us because it's an individual journey. But the bottom line is sometimes there's sort of these little eddies, and you have to kind of break off to the side, and you have to process these things for a little while. We're all on our own timing on how we make that journey. Um, but when, each time we get re-traumatized, of course, then we have to figure out a way to work through that. Like I said, I feel so blessed because when I came through this trial, through the 3 medicated sessions of the clinical trial experience, I went through what is Judith Herman um, wrote a book on trauma and healing, and she talks about traumatic recovery happening in 3 stages. For me, my 3 stages pretty much coincided with the sessions that I had with the MDMA. And it was sort of that repair and restoration, right, all the way to the third point of reconnecting and realizing that you are fully intact, you are perfect as you are, even with the experiences that we've had, and to shed that thinking that somehow there's something flawed or wrong with us because of the traumas that we've endured. if anything, patients, you are stronger than most people. And that resilience is something that should absolutely be celebrated. Like, you're a hero for having been through these kinds of experiences. And I would love it when someday we get to a point of where we look at people who have had more trauma and more, socioeconomic abandonment, all these kinds of traumas that are, big challenges to so many of us growing up, that instead of it being a point of shame or a point of, something as a deficit, that in fact that's something that people look up to and say, wow, you've been through some really amazing things, and yet here you are. What can we learn from you? Wouldn't that be an amazing future?
Wouldn't that be an amazing? I think we're creating it right now. I
Yeah.
think it's being created right now, and yet you are here.
Yeah.
Yet you are here. It's something so powerful about that when you said that. Wow. And
Oh,
I know the clinical trial is like its own like experience, but following that, was there other things that you had to do on the
uh,
daily basis to kind of maintain what was achieved during those trials?
yes. So I love that you raised that really important point, because even though the MDMA opens us, it's a catalyst, right? In my opinion, the more important part of even working with any psychedelic therapy, but even when you go sort of the other route of more somatic or, talk therapy, psychotherapy, I think you can still do that work. It might take longer. Um, but I think the big distinction is the integration is the most important thing. Like, in my sessions, I might have these, this awakening experience. Like, I know when I testified for the FDA, when the FDA committee was basically hearing from the public about why they should approve the MDMA assisted therapy, and I spoke at that hearing, and I addressed everyone, by talking about my experience through that and why it was so life saving. And I think one of the most important messages there is, it is the catalyst. It allows you to open a door to understand what you have to do. You still have to do the work. And I continue to do that work. I continue to go to therapy even now. So it's a wonderful way to open the door. Like I said, for me, I didn't even understand that it was a betrayal trauma that I was really trying to work through. So even fundamentally turning the corner on that with the MDMA, it's then what do you do with that going forward, right? And
Yeah.
that's been, I think, the more impactful part of my work now is the integration. I think it's so important, whether people decide to go the psychedelic route or other routes, you really have to continue to do the work.
Nothing, you can't get around the work part. You
No.
can't get around it. And what does that work look like for you? I know you said the therapy, right? So what are some of the other things that you do? Are you a big affirmations person? Do you do that?
I love affirmations. For my personal practice, it's one more of gratitude.
Mm,
So I have these bangles that I love to wear each day, and I have this practice of basically doing a gratitude as I'm putting them on. It's sort of setting an intention, right, for something that I'm really grateful for, and then my practice each evening is to again sort of revise what I'm grateful for. And then I like to go to sleep on one problem. And I know that goes against what most people say about like sleep, sanitation, so to speak. But I do like to put one issue that I'm sort of, that I need on the back burner. I like to put that in a little box. I envision putting a little box and putting it on a shelf. But I'm amazed at how often I'll wake up in the morning and have that aha. Our brains are so amazing, right? We can still process even though
yeah.
we're
Yeah.
not we're not
It's
going straight
amazing.
at it. So yeah.
I love that.
But
And,
but
and
more than that, to your point, I'm absolutely, I really do believe that we all individually find those things that work for us, and it's meditation and affirmations and just self care. I would love it if all of us had little treasure baskets that we put self care things into. And when we got a little stressed or we felt a little uneasy, we went and treated ourselves to something out of our treasure basket.
I think that's a beautiful, actionable item. Everybody, right now, get yourself a treasure basket for self care. So oils, anything, some teas, some bracelets, anything.
Candles, yeah,
Okay.
journals,
I love that. Maybe
chocolate.
that that may be a venture one day, maybe like a self-care kit that we're going to get from the Protea Foundation. I don't know. Maybe that's
Yeah.
something that's coming and we can, all benefit from that. But oh my gosh. Everything that you shared, I mean, we've gotten so deep into your story just from, just like the childhood traumas, but then, the trauma at the workplace, like that alone, and then working through all of that, coming through this clinical trial and experiencing something completely new, continuing to do the work. And now you're giving back in such a way through your foundation. So tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing with that.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest eye openers was once I came through the trial and realized that it had completely extinguished my sense or any risk of suicidality for me. It truly got me past the point of saying, that somehow that I was less than or I was flawed. Instead, I emerged as a person who said, gosh, I'm exactly okay as I am. If anything, I'm quite strong because of my experiences, right? Yay. um, but going forward, knowing that this is the case, like, what am I going to do about that? I wrote a letter to the MAPS organization and including Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, and, in gratitude, and to my therapist and the whole organization, just saying, I really do want you to understand how impactful this was. This really did save my life. I no longer have need for self-harm. I really now recognize that if anything, I should be angry at the people who, abused me and for all of these different things that happened. But more importantly, what am I going to do with that now? Right. And it's more turning the corner from being angry to turning the corner and being empowered. So, how are we going to help other people? Like I said, the biggest eye opener for me, though, was recognizing that people like myself who had ACEs, so chronic trauma in childhood, because of the situational factors, on top of just by virtue of gender violence being a female alone. I know that, World Health Organization has come up with statistics like 1 in 3 women will experience some form of gender-based violence in their lifetimes. And when you look at that kind of prevalence on top of these chronic childhood issues, you have millions of people that are suffering in silence. You have millions of people who don't want to confront, don't want to talk openly about the kinds of experiences they've had. And at the same time, aren't going to tell anyone in the medical community what has happened to them in the past. And so they never adequately connect the dots to current mental health. So it's no wonder why when you show up seeking, care for symptoms, if they do become, something beyond our own individual ability to cope with, that it is a situation where we're diagnosed, medications for depression and, and we're treating substance use and whatever. The real examination is about connecting those dots from, again, that traumatic history and current mental health and getting a full picture. Only when we do that can we really start to unravel what, you know, what kinds of treatments, what kinds of things we can do to really impact that. Otherwise, I liken it to going to the dentist and having your teeth polished. It looks pretty and it makes us feel better, but we're not really addressing the root cause, which is, an abscess, right, on our mental health. And so when I put it that way, I think people can really understand that in order to address traumatic injury, you have to adequately look at your whole history. When you look at your whole history and then you're able to work with your therapists and really figure out how to address those things or how to uncover other kinds of secondary traumas that can come up because of those originating traumas. It really is like peeling all the layers of the onion, right?
Yeah.
Um, but that's the hard work. That's the work we have to do. When I saw the prevalence of this and how much it impacts women and how many people are suffering in silence, I'm telling you, there's so much undiagnosed PTSD and complex PTSD in the world. And if we can get the word out there for people that when these symptoms crop up, it isn't something that's wrong with them. It's something that has happened to them. And just even acknowledging that, I think, gives you a different path forward. And I think it's one of self-compassion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I remember going to the doctor, and it was an emergency. It was a physical emergency, but they for some reason couldn't see or understand what I was going through physically, and ultimately they came down to trying to prescribe me a Xanax.
Mm, yeah.
I was so angry because I felt as though, okay, number one, I'm in physical pain and you're not doing enough to kind of figure out what's going on with that. You're kind of just like ruling off what I'm saying. And now you're kind of trying to say, I need a Xanax, right? And you're trying to give me something to calm my nerves, whatever it was. It just felt very insensitive. It felt very lazy. It felt whatever it felt. I felt super neglected, just all of those things, right? Um, and you think you go to the doctor, you tell them what's going on with you, and some effort is put into at least trying to get to the root cause, but not always. So we need people like you. We need organizations like the Protea Foundation who care about getting to the root of things. Because let's say if it was something psychological, right, that I was dealing with and it wasn't, connected to a physical pain, giving me a Xanax is not going to be, the solution for that, you know?
Agreed. If anything, it moves you further away from your feelings and from validating that experience. And I can relate. I've also had scenarios. I had a full paralysis event occur one time when I was trail running. For me, I decided after the SSRI incidents that I was no longer going to take any prescribed drugs. I was going to power through it on my own, and I became a triathlete. And so it was, I'm going to exercise myself into health. Um, but even so, right? Again, because of this traumatic injury in the body, right? Your body does keep that score. And so when I had this paralysis, it was at a time when I was incredibly stressed. I probably should have been more aware of my own stress level and different triggers that were happening. But again, like I said before, triggers multiply when you have a history of traumatic injury. So I myself didn't connect the dots for myself that I was really stressed as much as I was. But so I ended up in the emergency room with paralysis, with them believing that I might have suffered a stroke. So I had MRI, I had CAT scans, I had all of these things. And of course, walking out of there with the doctor basically, rolling their eyes at me saying, it's generalized anxiety disorder. That's all it
Mm-hmm.
is. It's all in your head. Um, talk about completely being, you know, disconnected, right? And then again, sort of a re-traumatization when you're not believed. So I can absolutely relate to that experience of yours, and I'm so sorry. And we do have so much work to do to help people. I feel like when these symptoms show up for people, the first question we should be asking is, do an ACEs. Let's see where you are on this. Let's figure out whether or not traumatic injury is any sort of, factor in all of this. That should be the very first thing that happens. And then we can move on to medication and, so forth. Um, but, our medical system is not set up to do an in-depth psychoanalysis, session and do a history taking. So we have to, as individuals, be aware of that, be aware that that's a factor, and look at that first when symptoms crop up. So, yeah.
Wow. I got emotional when you were talking, and it was just more so that you seeing me and understanding that perspective because I've tried to explain this to different people and kind of didn't really understand. Like, like, what do you mean? Well, right? Did you take the Xanax? I'm like, it's not about that. Like, it's not about the
Mhm.
Xanax. It's about the lack of care and concern that you would expect in our medical system to have for people who are in pain, whether it be physical or emotional pain. So it was just a really eye opening experience. So just hearing you, just like the care that you have, the compassion that you have for others, it's so inspiring. And I'm just so grateful to know you, to have community with you, and to also be able to take advantage of some of the programs that you may have going on that I myself or anybody who's listening who could take advantage of as well and really get on the path of healing that they need to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I just want to reiterate, if there's anything I can do, I actually answer my emails at my foundation. So, people can certainly reach out. We have so much work to do here, but it is really important. I feel like if the Me Too movement did such an extraordinary job of raising the awareness of people suffering from, especially gender-based violence, we need to move to that position of me healed, which is what I'm really trying to work toward now, which is to say, let's go from a place of empowerment, right? We've been
Yes.
angry. Now let's be empowered. But more importantly, no matter what the original source of trauma is, like I said, once it is within us, it has impacted all of us. And PTSD doesn't distinguish between someone because they've had a different kind of trauma. It again, the work that I'm doing has really revealed that we all end up converging again on that traumatic experience, and how are we going to empower ourselves going forward. It isn't different because one person experienced a different kind of trauma. The healing that has to occur, you know really is about that self, and recognizing self, and really trying to restore that that self-compassion, and that sense of power in the world. And that's why I really do. I see you, because when someone says take a pill, that is implying that somehow there's something wrong with you. And that is not the case. And I wish that we would all collectively recognize that the things that happen to us don't define us, but we have to help each other make them less significant so we can move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what can people do to connect the dots for themselves?
Oh, so many things. Again, I think really sharing the word that when symptoms show up for people, and there are many, and again, I've highlighted some of the biggest ones, but the anxiety, social anxiety, panic, substance use, depression, like all of those things, right? That the first thing we can do is raise the issue of whether or not there's a chronic trauma history, or any sort of trauma history, especially any sort of gender-based violence. We know that certain kinds of trauma have a higher prevalence of developing PTSD later in life. And gender-based violence is one of the highest, as is violence, like what you experienced. And I'm so sorry again for that. Um, it is, again, just raising an awareness around it might be something else, because I just don't want people to feel like there's something flawed within them, and that taking a medication is somehow going to magically make that trauma heal. It will come up again. And if and when it does, deeper work needs to be done. So I think that's one of the biggest messages I have out there, is just to kind of hold space for the idea that there's something bigger going on than just the symptoms.
It gives the hope. It gives the
Absolutely.
hope that there is something else that can be done. That
And
even
then
if it feels like
please,
you've exhausted every other, you know,
absolutely. And please, I mean, you can support more research, in particular around the psychedelic therapies. I think there is so much promise there because of what they are able to do in healing the neurological response to trauma long enough for you to actually be able to process trauma. I think one of the things that is so impactful with some of the psychedelic therapies is that when you are able to, in your own words, talk to yourself, right? When you are sitting with these medicines and you're able to tell yourself what you need, it's a whole different dynamic than you sitting across from a therapist who's doing the best job they can to help understand what you're going through, or but when you yourself don't even know what you need, it's really hard to identify that, and it's especially hard to tell somebody else how to help you.
yeah.
So we do need much more, research and support of these sciences. So Protea is 100% supporting these things. These are the most effective things that we have for trauma. far more than a lot of the other, approved medications that are out there. So I'm bewildered that the FDA did not approve MDMA therapy, although I understand it because of the context of what happened to some individuals who I think still have more work to do to resolve their own trauma. Um, but I hope as a society we're able to get there, because these medicines do hold so much
Well,
promise.
thank you so much for just bringing that research to us because sometimes I feel like as life goes on and life starts lifing and you have all these different commitments and responsibilities and things that you have to do, you kind of sometimes forget like where you can make an impact or where the research support needs to be, and I feel like you doing this work and taking that sacrifice from out of your everyday life. You could be doing so many other things, I'm sure, but this is your life's work, and we are so grateful to you for doing this work for us, for all of us.
Well, thank you. It's absolutely an honor. I wake up every single day because I don't want anyone to have to walk any day longer the way that I suffered. I mean, I just truly, if I can shorten anyone's experience, that is worth it. I wouldn't want anyone to live the way I've lived. So, thank you.
Final words to any woman that's listening, whether she's experienced any gender based violence, any sort of violence, any sort of traumatic injury, traumatic experience, witness a traumatic experience. If there's anything at all that you can say to help put a spark back into her halo, what would you say to her?
Mm, there is a path forward to take your power back. I absolutely welcome women to join our community. We don't, we just want them to lend their voice. We need to rise up and demand better treatment options for the kinds of experiences that we've had. And we need people to validate them instead of medicating and minimizing them. And I think the time is now to take that back.
The time is now. The time is now. Christina, thank you so much for your
Oh,
time today. You are truly a light to us all, and you've helped put a spark back in all of our halos. And how can we stay connected with you and your mission?
sign up at our organization, stay in touch, just be part of the dialogue. You have no idea how much it fuels me to know other voices are in the room, and so it is really wonderful to have people sign up and be part of our community.
All right, ladies, you heard it. We got to go sign up and support. And this has been another episode of Healing Her Halo.